Hello, this is a presentation on ham radio, a basic primer for beginners. So let's get into it. Here's the agenda. We'll first get into talking about what is ham radio with a few definitions. Officially known as amateur radio, ham radio refers to wireless communication devices operating on a set of amateur radio frequencies, ranging between 3 MHz and 3 GHz in bands most commonly known as HF, VHF, and UHF. Two-way radio walkie-talkies that often are called FRS or GMRS falls within the UHF band within 462 MHz. The name ham comes from the last names of the 3 members of the Harvard Radio Club in 1908 and was applied to their radio station call name. Some limitation and characteristics of radio. These are as follows. First is communication between two parties often are operating in what is called half or semi-duplex mode. That means that they either transmit or receive at one time. Most radios are designed with either this function to transmit or receive, but not at the same time. However, there are full duplex mode that is available on some higher-end models. Certain frequencies and digital modes also require a basic amateur radio operator license or qualification. Also, you cannot use encryption over analog, or CW, also known as Morse code communications. Encryption is limited to standard Morse code, packet radio, or digital modes such as DMR and others. And I'll get into these much later. The other prohibited uses is for commercial uses such as buying and selling goods. And finally, there are distance limitations based on transmission methods, such as, for example, where your walkie-talkies or your CB radios, they're usually limited to 30 miles or 56 kilometers line of sight. In this term, I will explain later. However, you may reach across world with more advanced methods with ham radio. And I'll explain more in detail. But first, for this presentation, we'll start with something very basic, and then we'll build up to more complex ideas, because in ham radio, things do get a lot more complicated as you get into talking about things like frequencies and digital modes and encryption. First off, let's talk about range. A typical 5-watt handheld transceiver, shorthand known as HT, an HT device, has a line of sight range about 56 kilometers. Often, this is shorter due to obstructed or blocked line of sight due to trees, buildings, and hills, and so forth. A radio station like a repeater has the advantage of being able to reach farther with higher power output, towers, and better antennas. With ham radio devices, you can communicate around obstructions by reflection, such as off of surfaces like mountains or other flat surfaces like buildings. However, such means of propagation is not that reliable and can result in undesirable effects such as known as fading, echoing due to waves traveling multiple paths in the midfield distances. Another thing that needs to be talked about is the access to repeater stations, which is enabled by most ham radios, and some GMRS radios. Before we get into discussing about repeaters, we need to define some terms. The first is squelch. Squelch is a subaudible tone which allows for two-way communications on half-duplex radios by muting users on a different squelch tone or no tone. The squelch tone acts like a key known as a continuous coded squelch system, and there are various names like CTCSS, which is what it officially is known as, or some of the proprietary or branded names like PL or CG. Or, if you're working in digital mode, digital coded squelch schemes like DSC. So, with this key, ham radio devices can access repeaters, and they can communicate much farther, aided with repeater stations. Few GMRS radios are repeater capable, however, and there are even fewer, or quite a few GMRS repeaters out there. They're out there. However, I haven't been able to find any in Canada that operate as a GMRS repeater. Just doing a cursory search for such stations. Another key term is offset. These are input and output transmissions, differences between two frequencies, or rather, the input and output transmission operate on two separate frequencies, and they're separated by an offset. For more information, you can go to this website to find out about repeaters in your area, such as in Calgary. Moving along, we're talking about the differences between ground versus skywave propagation. The techniques we've been talking about with communicating with a repeater, well, fits in the category of ground wave communication, or communicating with another handheld device. Now, with the access of a repeater, you can access very large distances with skywave propagation. These distances can often reach thousands of kilometers, such as with ionospheric reflection or tropospheric ducting, which often reaches up to 250 kilometers in distance. So this is where ham radio provides people to communicate without any reliance on any centralized means of communication. Moving on. We're going to talk about radio broadcast station very briefly. Some two-way radios and basically all ham radios can tune into the radio broadcast stations for emergency weather information. In Canada, this is called weather radio. In the US, its counterpart is called NOAA or NOAA weather radio. And here are some examples of radio stations in the Calgary area. These radio stations can also be accessed through the internet, as they're connected to the internet as well and broadcast through there. Speaking about ham radio for emergencies, the Amateur Radio Emergency Services, also known as ARES, is a group of licensed amateurs who have volunteered registered their qualifications and equipment for communication duty in the public service. Here are some examples of Calgary and area repeater frequencies where you can tune in the event that there is an emergency, such as the 2013 Calgary floods. I actually met the area of operation coordinator, who is a amateur radio enthusiast at the GPS store here in Calgary. He was the one who set up the base operations in High River when they needed emergency communications, and they set up comms there. RACES is an abbreviation for the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. That's another name that's used in the States. And you can actually use a ham radio in the event of emergency just by beginning your transmission with the words priority or emergency to get immediate attention. And you don't even need to have a license. So it's good to always have a ham radio, even if you don't have a license that's current. So we can also talk about next the different types of modes. Now that we've explained some of the different types of stations that you can have, let's make a distinction between simplex and duplex. Well, we've already talked about broadcast radio stations. These are operating in simplex mode. Basically, they transmit only and they never receive. However, with your communication device, they can receive and transmit in these handheld devices. These handheld devices are often have the feature of half duplex and also known as semi-duplex. These are systems that allow for transmit or receive at one time, but not at the same time, such as two-way radios, CB radios, and most ham radios, with the exception of a very few number of full duplex systems that allow for simultaneous receive and transmit communications. These are also available on some GMRS radios, but for some reason, they've discontinued a lot of these radios, and there's not that many repeaters available around North America. Full duplex is a feature found in telephones and cell phones. Now we're going to get into digital modes. Featured here are some handheld ham radios that offer digital modes. Digital modes are gaining in popularity and are featured on a few higher-end radios. These allow for access to digital communication networks. The advantages are numerous. They allow for group chats, longer range, and higher fidelity communications. Digital repeaters, they're a little bit more difficult and more involved than analog repeaters. They permit multiple users on the same channel not to hear each other. Talk groups on a digital repeater can be formed by programming your radio with a group ID or code, almost similar to the continuous tone system on an analog radio. There's some protocols to learn about. The most popular one is DMR, and it's one of the most popular encoded modes, and they're supported by basically these brands, Alinco, Anytone, and TOIT. There might be more, but you have to do some research to find out. Moving on, there are some other digital modes or encodings, such as Echolink, which is a free and partly open source, and this proprietary mode or encoding called WireX, which comes on proprietary with these Yaesu brands. Shown here below is a diagram of how a digital mode would work. With a handheld or base station, you can communicate to a digital node station, and a portion of that transmission goes to the internet, and it connects with another digital node station, and then retransmits to a handheld or another base station. Let's make a brief mention about packet radio and what it's all about. Packet radio, also known as PR or APRS, is a protocol for communicating data packets. It stands for Automatic Packet Repeating Service, and it's a digital mode available on some higher-end ham radios. The feature of this is that it allows for sending text SMSs, emails, photos, etc. Finally, FT8 is a digital mode referred to as a sound card mode, in which a ham radio is connected to a computer sound card. This allows for emails, SMS, and photos to be transmitted. Speaking about encoded protocols, Morse code or standard Morse code is a permitted encoded protocol and also has its own communication method. There were situations that call for Morse code transmission. This is quite advantageous in those signal-to-noise ratio environments. Emergency communication, it may even be a professional requirement for certain professions, such as sailors, pilot, or air traffic controllers. Often, repeaters and beacons identify themselves in Morse code. For those who are trying to learn Morse code, there are apps that make it easy to translate or generate Morse code. And this was something of a testing requirement until 2003. A pass on the test requires 5 or less errors for code receiving and sending all the necessary characters of approximately 75-letter sentence. So if you want to get your amateur radio license, what do you need to do? You need to do, first of all, a little bit of studying. And what this gives you is knowledge about the operating procedures, the theory about the devices, modulation modes, propagations, repeaters, safety precautions, and station equipment, things that we have already covered here in this presentation. In order to get your basic qualification, you need to write a 100 multiple choice question exam. 70% is a pass, and 80% gets you honors. So what does this get you? Well, whether you pass with 70% or 80%, you get a call sign that gives you a right to operate with the following RF output limits and allows you to operate at 250 watts with basic qualifications. If you graduate with honors, you get more frequencies, such as frequencies below the 30 megahertz range. And then if you go for your second exam to get the advanced qualification, you can use output limits up to 1,000 watts. And you get more amateur frequencies. You're able to build your own transmitting station, repeaters, sponsor a club station, and so on. Licensing is required by the Telecommunication Act, and so each operator is required to have a call sign. A call sign in Alberta, for example, starts with VA6 or VE6, followed by 2 or 3 letters. Here are some resources for studying for your license, such as the Canadian Amateur Radio License Online and Book Study Guide from RAC at this link here below. The Government of Canada also has an amateur radio exam generator where you can write a randomly generated exam with test questions. And finally, here's resources here local in Calgary. Vince, the man who I met at the GPS store. And here's his website. He is a test examiner, and he was there at the 2013 Calgary floods as the coordinator for the communication center in High River. Speaking about hardware, these devices come in various shapes and sizes, such as these HT or handheld transceiver devices, starting from the left with this Baofeng, which is very affordable and gets you started with ham radio. Next is this Yaesu branded handheld transceiver, ham radio, and it also gives you everything that the Baofeng gives. In addition, it gives you access to digital modes, although it's proprietary. Further to the right, you have a mobile base station. I don't have any images of repeater stations, but those can be basically put together by combining antennas with a mobile base station, or even two Baofengs that can be hooked up together, one set up in transmit and another in receive. Further along here, there are some hardware that do not require amateur licenses. These are not ham radios. These are two-way radios, and they're operating in the FRS/GMRS radio bands. CB radios, which is often a common feature found in trucks, they operate in the under 30 megahertz frequencies, around the 29 megahertz range, and they don't require licenses either. What do require special licenses are certain devices for professions such as in aviation or marine. With these devices, you can communicate with other vessels in aviation or marine. Accessories. If you buy a base station, you may want to get an antenna, or even if you get a handheld, you may want to get a longer antenna. Often these handheld have removable antennas, and you can attach a longer antenna for longer range. Other accessories featured here are portable antennas, dipoles, antenna tuners, which allow for greater efficiency for transmitting through the antenna, and power supply. Other accessories here feature directional antennas, and they can range anywhere from $40 to $200 or $300 or more, depending on the complexity and the amount of gain that you want from these directional antennas. Featured here are antennas that are known as Yagis. Now, a word of security and privacy. There is no expectation of privacy when you're communicating on amateur radio frequencies, as they are public, and you are required to state your identifying call sign at the beginning and end of your call, and every 30 minutes. So you got to ask yourself, should you be discussing sensitive and private topics? Obviously not. Can you be tracked? Sure you can. Your radio signal can be picked up by anyone or any station that is listening, and through triangulation, your approximate location may be determined. So with this, why get a ham radio? Communications for emergency uses, definitely up there for those who are prepping when central infrastructure is down, and for those situations that you don't want to use the central infrastructure and depend on them to operate for your communications, or any ability to listen to emergency broadcasts and get the unfiltered reports from across the world on current events from other countries. Other situations may be for coordinating and movement of goods and services and people. That brings us to the end of part 1, and now there's time for questions before we go on to our next topic, which will be secure radio communications. Now we're back. Let us continue on our topic on secure radio communications. Our definition of what we mean by secure radio communication is found here in our tent. We want to establish secure voice or text communication between small, local groups of trusted individuals without using pre-established infrastructure. And to achieve these, we have these 7 criteria listed here below, and I'll go through each of them in detail. But what will help with our discussion here is this illustration of this pyramid. Starting at the bottom of the pyramid are those technologies and methods that are easiest to intercept and understand, in which the most people can hear and understand you. As you start going up layers, it becomes more difficult to intercept and understand as you ascend to the top of the pyramid, and where fewer people can hear and understand you. Keep this in mind, that there are layers and layers to secure radio communications. And the first one is frequency. But before we go, here for your reference, I've obtained most of this knowledge by watching this YouTube channel video on secure radio communications. So give credit where credit is due. Speaking about credit where credit is due, let's talk about frequencies. Starting at the bottom of the pyramid, we have our most common bands, and these are VHF and UHF. These are found on most walkie-talkies. So if you're talking on these bands, chances are you're going to be listened to with anyone with these devices. Now, if you go up to HF bands, those frequencies that are below 30 megahertz, these are less common, but still within access of the general population. Very common if you're dealing with hams, and those people can, with ham devices, can directionally find you. As you keep going up in the pyramid, the next layer is the 6 meter and the 8 millimeter bands, and these are less common ham bands, and they're hard to find these handhelds that are capable of these frequencies. Further along, there's 700, 800, 900 megahertz. These are mostly used by businesses or law enforcements, and usually these radios are a little bit more expensive. And then finally, the oddball frequencies, really obscure frequencies where they're not on most handsets, they're slightly out of band, or you're using a combination of that with duplexing with wide offsets and so on. We've already discussed the distinction between analog and digital, but we can go over it here again. With analog, it's very common. It's easy to use legally without a license with basically either GMRS or FRS bands. Now digital is becoming more and more common among ham devices, but still it is not on every device. It's not possible to use legally without a license, so it sets a little bit of a higher standard or bar. The digital modes, however, are as follows, and listed here with DMR as most common, and the rest are proprietary or not as common. Encryption. And here's a topic that I'm not really an expert in, but here goes. With the very bottom of the pyramid, we have what is known as privacy tones, and these are really not private at all. These privacy tones, also known as CTC-SS, which we've mentioned before in prior portion of this talk, or PL tones, these give you a false sense of security or privacy, and they shouldn't be called it, although they're marketed as privacy tones, because anybody with a GMRS or FRS walkie-talkie can basically switch your tones and eavesdrop on your conversation. Finally, there are what is called digital modes. Digital modes, we've discussed, it's encrypted, and if you're able to listen to it on an analog radio, it will come across as blips and chirps, and it won't be intelligible unless you also have a digital handset and can listen in and also operate on the same encoding interface. Next, we get into what is called trunk systems. They're not really encrypted, but it's a special mode that police use to make it hard to be heard by civilians, but they still comply with no encryption laws. Interesting enough. Weird proprietary encryption, such as 128-bit and 40-bit, etc. This varies by manufacturers. That's not easy to verify because these are usually closed source. And the next is the gold standard for encryption, that's AES 256. Generally, this is not crackable. Although, if you have something like a backdoor on one of these headsets and you can figure out how to crack the hardware, have physical access to it, then maybe you can crack the encryption. But generally, AES 256 is not feasibly crackable unless you have a quantum computer. It's very difficult to. Moving on. Now, there is a word about low-tech encryption, such as using encoded words in your speech, such as saying something like, homework update for distance education students, work problems 72, 86, 97, and 51. And between you and your partner, or your third party, 51 can mean something else, like pick up this package from so-and-so. Another thing to discuss is the issue of radio direction finding, or DF for short. And it helps to illustrate this over an overhead map, as shown above. As someone is communicating, they give off signal and also their location. But for someone who is trying to locate them with a listening device, they can use triangulation to pinpoint their location in a general area. So represented by these red dots in the upper left-hand corner. And as time goes on, as more transmissions occur, you start to get a clear picture of where these signals are coming from, and you can pinpoint them to, a few homes or within a block. Another issue is how to address this is with power output, and just using the minimum amount of power and not any more to reach your area of operation or your intended audience. So represented in the red blob in the lower right-hand corner is your intended audience. Your unintended audience is actually the adversarial listening post. And here is an example of what a radius of signal communication with limited power, just to cover the area of operation where your intended audience will be. Another way to deal with directional finding is through terrain masking and using directional antennas. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have omnidirectional antennas, which are basically standard on all handsets. Basically, ham radios that are handheld all come with dipole antennas, and they radiate a signal equally in all directions, ideally. However, you can direct your signal, and that allows you to send farther, potentially, through these methods, or to funnel your signal in a constricted cone of communication, as shown on the next slide. Also like to mention directional antenna and how that can look like. Directional antennas will funnel signal in a cone, much like terrain mapping. Well, first of all, let's talk about terrain mapping, because it's more like a situational geographical advantage when you're communicating or transmitting down a valley. And that signal will be guided by the valley as you're communicating down a valley. And it will be constricted to the two sides of a valley. Well, that's what directional antenna is basically doing. It is constricted based upon the nature of the antenna. It is radiating in one direction and allows you to transmit further with lower power requirements. So having something like that, even if you have an adversarial listening post trying to pick up on signals, a directional antenna won't be picked up by that. And it also makes it very difficult to jam the signal because it'll take an immense amount of power to overcome the signal noise. Moving on is a technique called data burst, such as limiting your amount of communications. At the very bottom of the pyramid is your Sunday evening, afternoon, lazy, don't care about anybody listening to this transmission. These are known in the HF world or the ham radio world as rag chewing, just talking without really caring about people listening or whether or not they're listening or not. Now that can be mitigated by limiting the amount of transmission to a few seconds, just to say exactly what you need to say to who needs to hear it. But because the nature of voice and even that those few seconds can be used to triangulate your location. So you can step up into the world of digital and transmit through text, and usually these are not encrypted or sending data packets through APRS, also known as packet radio, which we covered, or even using a combination with other encrypted text-based comms, which are even better, and using voice only when needed, and even then using short transmission from multiple locations to confuse the listening post. And finally, a last criteria for choosing a ham radio that will be able to ensure that you have secure communication with a trusted group is its ease of use. What use is your fancy ham radio if it's too complicated to set up and you end up not communicating at all? So this is something that you need to keep in mind. Clearly at the very bottom of the pyramid are your analog handheld. Basically anybody who can pick up a radio can talk through it. On the next step up are digital modes, and those require licenses. It's a little bit out of grasp for those who haven't passed their license or know how to use a digital handheld. Going up further are the pseudo-encrypted handhelds with encryption like AES-256. As you go up higher and you start to add things like extra antennas, directional antennas, computer interface and data modes, it just becomes more difficult to program and use. So that basically brings us to the summary of this presentation. I will talk about some hardware that I recommend that meet these criteria, such as a ham radio that has digital modes with AES-256 encryption, limiting the amount of power, limiting your direction, and where you're using the geography to your advantage with terrain masking, and using obscure or rare frequencies or odd offsets for transmission. And finally, something that's easy enough that a wide enough range of people in your trusted group can purchase this affordably, and it's easy enough to use. So on my first cursory search for something, I found this brand and model that offers encryption and data communication. This ham radio operates in digital mode, which also allows for text messages, and it's quite affordable at $230. Now that may break the bank for some of you, but that's pretty affordable for something that can do something which, a basic cell phone can do maybe like 10, 20 years ago. And all of this can be done without central infrastructure. It also supports APRS communications, so you can hook it up to your computer and send emails and pictures, other data packets, and so forth. Finally, there are directional antennas such as this Yagi. They come in various prices and configurations and compatibilities with different frequencies, so there is some research required before you go out and purchase one of these as well. That brings us up to the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening. I know this topic may not be the most interesting to a lot of you, but it's something that's necessary in the event that comm radio centralized communication goes down or you're in a remote location. And basically, it is your connection to the outside world. There's a lot to learn here. There's a lot of reading and study involved in order to get your license. But even if you don't have your license, having one of these devices on hand in an emergency can be a lifesaver. So thank you for listening, and leave any questions in the chat below or the comment box, and I will try to get back to you. Thank you.